Hello everyone and welcome to today's Connect and Learn webinar. I'll begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. My name is Rebecca. I'll be moderating today's webinar on consumer experiences of long-acting injectable buprenorphine and implications for clinical practice. As many of you will be aware, this is a part of a series of Connect and Learn webinars designed to support AOD clinicians throughout Victoria. It's funded by the Victorian Department of Health and hosted by Turning Point. We do want our webinars to be interactive, so please use the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout the webinar. What I'll do is I'll collate those questions and ask our presenters at the end. Our webinars are recorded and they will be made available on the Turning Point website. If you join our mailing list, we'll let you know when they're available on the website. Now I'd like to also ask you to stay until the end, please. We've got a really short exit survey that will be available via a QR code, and also we'll email it to you later. The QR code will feature on the last slide. The presenters have gladly agreed to send the slides to you, so they will be made available after the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters, Tony Barnett and Sione Crawford. Thank you both very much for joining us today. Tony is a research fellow at Turning Point. He's working in the clinical and social research team. His work explores the social and cultural context of alcohol and other drug use, treatment, including novel therapeutic interventions, and policy. His work draws on social science methods to provide in-depth accounts of consumers, carers, and clinicians' experience of addiction treatment, care, and recovery. Thank you again, Tony. And joining Tony is Sione Crawford, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Harm Reduction Victoria. Sione has worked in New South Wales, the ACT and Victorian organisations of people who use drugs since 2004 in a number of roles, including peer education, community development, policy, advocacy and management. Thank you so much, Sione. Now, Tony, I'll pass it over to you to start. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Rebecca. My name's Tony and I work here at Turning Point in the clinical and social research team. And the title of my talk today is Tracing the Affordances of Long-Acting Injectable Buprenorphine, a qualitative study of clients' experiences in Australia. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, and maybe Sione and I will try to synthesise this. For the rest of the presentation, I'll be using the term depot buprenorphine, but many of you in the sector will be familiar with the term long-acting injectable buprenorphine and what's eventuated as the acronym LABE clinics and so forth, but I'll use the term depot buprenorphine. There are my contact details, so my Twitter handle and also my email address. So if you don't have the opportunity to ask a question that you are interested in, feel free to get in touch and I'm happy to answer that over the next few weeks. I just wanted to mention the long list of co-authors that also assisted with this study. And just in the interests of full disclosure as well, this study was funded by Chemist AB, the pharmaceutical company responsible for one of the depot buprenorphine products on the Australian market called Buvidal. So, opioid agonist therapies like methadone and sublingual buprenorphine, they've been around for a long time, and there's a very strong evidence base that they're effective in the treatment of opioid concerns and opioid dependence. Having said that, though, many of you will be familiar with this. Daily dosing regimes can be particularly onerous and strict. So, for example, for clients on methadone or sublingual buprenorphine programs, attending a pharmacy or clinic each day can be particularly onerous. Lining up at pharmacies, for example, can also be associated with increased stigma when people are identified or treated differently within pharmacies or labelled as being opioid dependent. Also, another factor that has played out definitely in the Victorian system is the costs associated with daily dosing. So typically dispensing fees could be as much as, or even slightly more, much as 20% of someone's income, particularly if they're on a Centrelink payment. So up until this point, all of those factors have really meant that daily dosing comes with a particularly strict treatment program. Now, I guess depot buprenorphine, one of the promises of depot buprenorphine is to overcome some of these factors. But before I went on, I just wanted to go through this figure just to give you a very simple but nonetheless small overview of the way the technology actually works. So, I mean, the active ingredient, buprenorphine, is still the same. It's the method of delivery that is novel about this new treatment. And it involves an injection of a liquid product under the skin that under the skin releases and forms a liquid crystal. That liquid crystal then biodegrades over time to complete resolution. And typically depot buprenorphine products in Australia come in weekly or monthly formulations and are released into the body over that extended time period. And buprenorphine acts on within the brain as it normally would. Now, there's a growing evidence base, and there have been a couple of recent clinical trials demonstrating the effectiveness and safety of depot buprenorphine. But having said that, though, there hasn't been a lot of qualitative research that provides in-depth accounts of clients' experiences of how they experience care and how they experience moving over to depot buprenorphine. So that was the idea of this study. We had 3 aims. So we wanted to explore clients' views about being prescribed depot buprenorphine and care, their views about the social effects that depot buprenorphine afforded for them for their lives, and also their views about how future care and client information could be improved. So in order to achieve those aims, over the next couple of slides, I'll just give you an idea of the methods that we used. So we conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews with 30 participants in Australia, all of whom had been prescribed depot buprenorphine. We recruited both from New South Wales and Victoria, and we wanted to do that just to, as many of you may know, the prescribing systems in Victoria differ to New South Wales. So we wanted to recruit participants, some who might have been accessing pharmacies, others who might have been accessing clinics previously, just to get an idea of whether there are any differences in the way they experienced moving to depot buprenorphine. Interviews that we conducted were audio recorded, transcribed and analysed thematically. And I guess in our analysis, we were guided by the theoretical work on affordances, just that quote there that I'll unpack. But affordances represent the potential that a biomedical technology, such as depot buprenorphine, what that might hold for enabling or constraining human action. So that's all very technical, but I guess in a more human language, we wanted our analysis to remain sensitive to the idea that a singular stable intervention such as depot buprenorphine could have different or multiple effects for clients who were from different backgrounds. Just looking at the a summary of the participant characteristics. Participants had an average age of 47 years, ranging from 27 to 66 years, about a 50-50 split in terms of gender. Most were born in Australia. 2 people were from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. And in terms of education and daily activity, we recruited people who were from a whole, wide spectrum. Some people were engaging in employment or volunteering and had, significant social supports. Other people in the study were particularly marginalised, for example, experiencing homelessness at the time of the interview. So in terms of background, there was a wide array of different experiences. Most people were in treatment for heroin dependence. And in terms of depot buprenorphine treatment history, at the time of the interview, everyone was still in treatment, and I'll reflect on that later, just as far as the limitation, but everyone was still in treatment and they'd been in treatment for an average of 8 months at the time of the interview. So before I go on to the next few slides that provide participant accounts, I just wanted to give you a really high-level, quick overview of the main themes that emerged from our interviews and some of the sub-themes. So we've got 3 columns here: experiences of care, social practical effects of being prescribed depot buprenorphine, and finally, views about improvements for care and client information. So over the next few slides, I'll really dive into this second column by presenting some participant accounts of their experiences. But just before I do that, I just wanted to give you a quick summary of some other themes. So generally speaking, for participants in this study, depot buprenorphine was considered a positive addition to treatment. And for certain clients, for example, those who lived in rural areas, it was considered particularly helpful in overcoming barriers that I'd experienced in the past. For example, having to travel a significant distance in order to daily dose. So having said that though, although depot buprenorphine was generally, I guess, but I will give you a much more nuanced account in a second. Although it was experienced generally as a positive addition, it was still viewed that psychosocial aspects of care for clients who desired them were important. As one participant said, look, depot buprenorphine isn't a magic cure for opioid dependence. You know, people still might require commitment or, you know, access to different supports if they so desire. The main concern that participants had in this study was whether or not depot buprenorphine would I guess act as prescribed and hold people for a week or a month in order to not experience withdrawal and so forth. So yeah, many participants described how they had those sorts of conversation with prescribers at the start about to discuss that uncertainty. Just moving on to this third column. In terms of improvements for care, many people that we interviewed thought that depot buprenorphine should be advertised more widely. Also, and this perhaps relates to uncertainty about the way the product worked, people thought that future guidelines for clients could be improved in a number of ways. And one of the main improvements that was identified was info about how to taper off and be deprescribed depot buprenorphine. Furthermore, it was thought that, there could be better online information that was accessible about depot buprenorphine. And specifically, people wanted to hear other people with lived experience, their accounts, rather than perhaps just reading other forms of knowledge. So I guess peer education was identified as perhaps being able to be improved in the future. Now, drilling down into this second column, so I've got a number of participant accounts here, and these are obviously pseudonyms that I'm using. So Terry spoke about depot buprenorphine and stigma and identity, or how it impacted his sense of self. So I'll read out what he said. He said, not having to take a medication every day gives you a sort of liberty to think of yourself in other ways. You don't keep identifying that you have this problem with opiates every day through the act of having to take sublingual buprenorphine. To be liberated of that enables you, I guess, to form a new identity. So in Terry's account, and this was also echoed by other participants, moving away from the strict treatment regimen of daily dosing onto a weekly or monthly depot formulation meant that he didn't, or gave him an opportunity, or afforded him another way to which to view himself. And I guess he used the term liberated to be, released from a previous strict treatment regime. In addition to that, in Sarah's account, she spoke about how moving to depot buprenorphine afforded a sense of freedom. So as she stated, all we've got to do is time it right. So if we want to go away, we both make sure when my injection is, and we work it around the injection time, have the injection, and we can bugger off. We don't have to worry about counting out doses, locking them away from my son, doing that whole secrecy thing. So for Sarah, not having to go into, say, for example, a pharmacy each day afforded this sense of geographical freedom and being able to travel more easily than perhaps otherwise, where you might have to create an arrangement with a pharmacist and so forth. In addition to that, other people spoke about other affordances, like the opportunity to be a caregiver. For example, in this account, Christine said that the biggest thing for me with it is that, like, I've got 2 grandkids, 8 and 10, that live down in a regional city, and I can just go down there whenever I want, just on a whim, don't have to organise the chemist to go and get dosed at. So for Christine, this, I guess, sense of freedom allowed her to provide care to her grandchildren. And in another account, Brad spoke about how moving to depot buprenorphine sort of freed up time for him to engage in employment. He said, I think depot buprenorphine just gives people a chance to work. You know what I mean? If you want to go and try to live a normal life, you can do that without going to the clinic every single day and lining up and stuff like that. So we were sort of being a little bit critical about this term of normalcy, or what normality means for everyone, and does that make other people abnormal and so forth. So yeah, it's something that we unpack in the paper, and I'll send you a link to that at the end of I'll send you the title of the paper at the end of the talk. But yeah, we were unpacking this concept of, yeah, what does a normal life mean in this instance? So I guess thus far, these affordances that I've spoken of for clients that move to depot buprenorphine, they've been particularly positive, but that wasn't always the case. And in this account, I'm looking at Kevin's example. So at the time of the interview, Kevin was in a park, I think, and he was experiencing homelessness at that time. And as he described, he was, had some complex stuff going on around drug and alcohol and different harms and contact with the criminal justice system. For him, moving to depot buprenorphine, I guess, disrupted valued social and practical supports that he had at a clinic. And as he said, I missed company, people. We used to listen to music around the table and talk at the clinic. It was a social thing, I lost that, yeah. So there were other supports that Kevin spoke about, for example, being able to easily access harm reduction programs like needle and syringe programs and so forth. So I guess it was, yeah, and there were a couple of other participants who also had similar experiences. And in view of that, another participant, Gary, he made the comment, I think one thing you've got to make people aware of when they get on this program is get a hobby, get something to do, because you're not going to the clinic on a daily basis. So there's a hole in your day for a couple of hours. Your social scene is going to change because you're not going to the clinic. That's one of the big concerns that I had, was what was I going to fill my day with? Now, I'll reflect further on that in a couple of slides, but I just wanted to speak about another affordance that depot buprenorphine, or how depot buprenorphine afforded another experience. Again, for Terry, there was a feeling that moving to depot buprenorphine, I guess you might say, constrained his perception of personal control over dosing and the feeling of a drug being in his body. So he said, even with a weekly dose, that still has a tail. So you still have that latent amount in your system, whereas you're more in control of how much is in your system if you're on a daily dose. I guess what I miss would be being more in control of, able to wean yourself off opiates. So for Terry, there's a feeling that, receiving daily buprenorphine sublingually gave him opportunities perhaps to not use a dose for whatever reason if he didn't want to, or the sense that it was easier to taper off when you weren't on depot buprenorphine. So again, coming back to what I said when I gave the overview, it emerged that it was important that there could definitely be some more more information available to prospective clients about how to taper off the product and so forth. So I just thought I'd, before I wrap it up, offer some insights reflecting on some of these participant accounts and what they mean for clinical practice. So what we see is that a singular stable intervention, such as long-acting injectable buprenorphine, it can have different effects and afford different clients different experiences depending on their socioeconomic status, the level of supports they've got, whether they appreciate going to the clinic on a daily basis. So depending on all those factors, people can experience depot buprenorphine differently. particularly for those who might have been marginalised and valued, the supports that daily dosing might offer. We thought, and look, I'm a researcher, I'm not a clinician, so I'm really interested in your feedback if you work in clinical practice. But we thought that it was important that, we thought that many clients might benefit from further psychosocial supports or perhaps being referred to supports in order to create engagement and so forth. As I said earlier, future resources might be updated with more clear product information. And also, there's a whole, I know that other research will hopefully be coming out soon, but future research might like to look at the views and experiences of other types of clients. Also, exploratory work on how clinicians have experienced depot buprenorphine, especially in view of one thing I should have mentioned that all of these interviews were conducted pre-COVID or just as COVID was coming in. So it'd be interesting to explore how these themes play out during and after, if I can possibly not safely use that word at the moment, but what people's COVID experience has been like. And there's also room to co-design with clinicians of all types from different practice areas, co-design resources and how treatment services might be optimised in order to ensure that people have a smooth experience when they consider moving to depot buprenorphine. So everything that I've discussed, it's in a paper that we recently published. If you want a copy of this paper, please feel free to get in touch, but through the workforce development team here, I'll also give them a copy. So I'll just wrap it up. I'll leave you with those acknowledgements. I just did want to very quickly especially thank the participants for their generosity and time in participating. And also thanks very much to Sione for coming today as well to provide us with some more insights as well. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. I think it's all going according to plan so far. My name's Sione. I'm as I was introduced, I'm the CEO of Harm Reduction Victoria. I'm sure a lot of you know HRVIC, as I'll probably shorten it to. We're an organisation we're a peer organisation of people who use drugs and people at all sort of stages of that continuum. I myself have been on pharmacotherapy many times at different times in my life, and so this topic is of personal interest, but also real interest and importance for our community that we work for and with. If I can. Okay, cool. So a lot of the information a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about today really comes through our Pams service, the Pharmacotherapy Advice and Mediation Service run by Sarah Lord, who also likewise gave me a huge amount of the information that's in this presentation today. A lot of it really is hers and her team's and the consumers and clients that call through to Pams in particular. So for those of you who don't know Pams, it's a short-term solution-focused program with its primary aim of keeping people on treatment ultimately, and we work across Victoria. So our reflections are really going to be around labour, really going to be focused on Victoria's community-based system, to be honest. And I mention that because I think that one of Pam's sort of primary aims is to match treatment. Match treatment with the clients, to match clients with prescribers and chemists, and I think that's a really important theme that Tony's already spoken to, but also that I'll come back to. I just want to really put in context, I suppose, where we're coming to this from, which is that for HRVIC, the people in the community that we work with are not primarily seeking to abstain or to completely eliminate their illicit drug use. Some people are, but a lot of people are seeking just to stabilise or to keep themselves as safe as possible for a while through a harm reduction approach. So essentially, we need to acknowledge when we're talking about any kind of treatment that we're bringing into the system, that people have a range of reasons for being on the opioid treatment program, and they're seeking a range of outcomes. It can be harm reduction, as I mentioned, it can be reduction in abstinence support, or it can indeed be chronic pain management. I think as Tony's already sort of alluded to, I would say that, I'd confirm that from our perspective, the overwhelming majority of people that we've spoken to in our community, and that Sarah in particular and Pams has worked with around long-acting injectable bupe, the overwhelming majority of people who are happy with this choice are those who are seeking stability and abstinence. But we also know that's not the whole story, so we try and illustrate that a bit. As I mentioned, treatment matching is an important part of what we do. And as I said, Tony's covered the fact that when depot bupe is the right treatment for the right person at the right time, there's often really clear success. He's covered this well, and for us, the people we've talked to, it's usually related to freedom, to freedom from the program, freedom to travel, and reducing stigma. Having more time is a double-edged sword, as we've talked about, but really importantly, again, as Tony mentioned, the mindset of not dosing daily. So, you know, WAC is the magazine that we produce 3 or 4 times a year, depending on contributions, to be honest. But one of the great contributions we received last year was from a guy with a pseudonym of Max, who wrote a pretty long article about his experience on LABE. And, you know, he referred to the beginning of his journey on long-acting injectable bupe as being about dreaming, basically. A wave of excitement came over me as I thought of the possibilities of having an OTP without being tied down to a pharmacy or daily dosing. And of course, abstinence is not for everyone, as I mentioned. Although I think that the AOD service system that we work in tries very hard to be person-centered, I have to admit that for most people who use drugs, we don't necessarily feel like the treatment that we receive, especially pharmacotherapy level treatment, is particularly person-centered, and it's not necessarily something. And one of the ways that I'd illustrate that is that it's actually not very easy as a person who's on pharmacotherapy and who might want to continue using illicitly occasionally. It's really not, I would say, not possible in the system we have to speak really honestly to your prescriber or your clinician about this. As clinicians, you may think that people can speak honestly to you, but speaking to you as a person who's been in that circumstance, it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. The day that I gave a urine test that wasn't perfectly clean was, you know, my doctor nearly fell over, and yet I'd never once said to her at any point that, you know, that my aim was to be completely abstinent, but she'd made those assumptions and we just hadn't talked about it. You know, we worked through that, but it's not necessarily the best way to kind of have those conversations. Anyway, quite often in our community, we see the negative side of that. And another story that I want to bring to this is that of Jared, who was fairly close to me and someone I knew quite well. And he was 46 and he was injecting regularly, a few times a week, heroin, a few times a week. But it certainly wasn't 2 or 3 times a day or anything like that. He was pretty stable, had a job, etc. But due to motivations that weren't necessarily his own, he went off methadone and went on to long-acting injectable bupe. Primarily, this was about not wanting to have to go to the chemist every day, and to do with his partner, and not wanting her to think that he was a junkie. So he went on to long-acting injectable bupe. But the thing is, he wasn't really ready. And within a few months, although his heroin use had completely disappeared, his meth use increased significantly. He felt like he couldn't, I talked to him numerous times about this, and he felt like he couldn't let either his doctor or his partner down by discussing it. And for him, it began to spiral quite badly, and he was in a far worse place, despite having moved on to this new treatment than he was in previously when he was on methadone and using heroin occasionally. It's not the whole story, of course, and Max in our story in WAC seems to handle using drugs on top of his long-acting injectable bupe quite well. And for him, it probably comes back to the stability of the use. However, when you actually read the language of his story, it could be construed as being a bit of a concern that he's not talking about this with his prescriber. So essentially, he talks about still being able to override his injectable bupe by taking large doses of heroin, much larger than normal, and he'd usually do that towards the end of the cycle of his injectable bupe injection. And you know, for someone like me who's been, you know, versed in overdose response and harm reduction, it starts ringing alarm bells, because he's increasing his dose at a time when his pharmacotherapy dose is potentially ebbing away. Obviously, for him, he's found a way through that, but it's not the most stable sort of way to go about things. But for him, he feels like he's got a system and a routine working for him, and then his cravings for using would go away, and he'd be okay to use again. I know a lot of clinicians will probably say, well, his dose is wrong, etc. But for him, I think that was a bit of a choice. And for him, it was definitely a huge improvement for him. Previously, he had money in the bank and a fridge full of food and having bills paid, and he wasn't doing crime. So for him, it was working well. I think we have to be open to the idea that clients and people's versions of working well might be different to those of many clinicians. And LAB can still have, and long-acting injectable bupe can still have a really important role to play in that. But both the anecdotes I talk about, I think, feel like they're different versions of the same issue, which is that many people who are on pharmacotherapy still feel like they have difficulty being open, and there's a huge amount of deeply ingrained self-stigma, both about ourselves and about illicit drug use in particular. In Jared's case, he couldn't open up. And in Max's case, he speaks later on in his letter about how he also started to use increasing amounts of ice, just as Jared did. But his solution was not to go into a downward spiral, but to seek out a counsellor and to attend peer support. So they're both dealing with that stuff in slightly different ways, and clearly, it seemed to me, at least, the person who felt empowered enough to be open and take his issues to be supported had better outcomes. No surprise, I suppose. Through different mediums, we've had a huge amount of feedback that the lack of interaction at the chemist and the dosing point can be a shock. And again, Tony mentioned that a little bit. It's really important that people know that this might occur and that they're assisted to prepare for this. It's not necessarily something people would necessarily think about, because a lot of our desire is to get away from that idea of having to report into the chemist once a day or twice a week or 3 times a week. And I just make a note that underneath all of this is a system of pharmacotherapy in Victoria and across Australia that really mitigates against a huge amount of support from our prescribers when you're talking about going to see a GP, for instance, who has a 5 or 10 minute appointment with you. Just enough time to get your script dealt with. Is not really enough time to deal with other health issues unless you sort of think to make a longer appointment. And I think that that's a serious issue, and potentially one of the reasons why we see people sort of feel unprepared sometimes, I think. I just wanted to make a quick note about prison. For people who are on bupe and naloxone and in prison, injectable bupe has been very positive for a lot of them. We know that there's a really thriving black market in prison for Suboxone strips, and they can go for hundreds of dollars. There's a lot of violence sometimes for some people and standover related to it as well. Not for everyone all the time, but it definitely happens. Injectable bupe really has the potential to assist people to be able to be a bit more stable and not have to sell their dose or feel like they have to for whatever reason. Finally, it took a while, I think, but finally, injectable bupe is now being part of the system for long enough that Justice Health is also paying the cost of the first month of pharmacotherapy when people are out of prison. That takes me to the Victorian system of cost, and I just want to, probably nearly finished, but I just wanted to sort of unpack this a little bit. Tony spoke about it to a degree, but from the consumer standpoint and where we're standing and looking at this cost, and especially in relation to injectable bupe, is a really major issue. It's one of the major reasons just generally for pharmacotherapy that people call Pams, but for long-acting injectable bupe in particular. Now, I've got to say that a lot of this information came really from last year when we were putting together this information for another talk. But I think the issues sort of remain that in certain circumstances, the price ranges for people getting injectable bupe in the community and private system range quite dramatically from very low when you're involved in a community health service or a turning point or whatnot, through to more than $75. We've heard much higher numbers than that, but $75 seems like a fairly conservative kind of estimate, of which is what a lot of people are paying to have their monthly shot. Now, that's less than a month's worth of methadone doses, for instance, which is around $140. But the point is, people having to pay it up front straight away is tricky, and people are really struggling to come up with that amount all at once. Whereas, if need be, people can pay their $5 or $6 a day if they have to pay day to day or week to week, but coming up with between $75 and $100 is quite a lot. And it's just, I don't know, I think it just illustrates that the way that we run our system is just not actually very conducive to change or to reform or to making things easier for consumers. It's really exacerbated, I suppose, by the community prescriber approach in Victoria, where basically a huge amount of the 16,000 or so people in pharmacotherapy are dosed and prescribed in the private sector, and those are small businesses, and they need to make some money to run. And finally, I just wanted to sort of flag, I suppose, we've had a lot of people talking to us about different types of side effects, and in particular skin lesions and pain around injection sites, which wouldn't be a surprise to many people. However, we definitely hear over and over again that people feel like they're not being heard when they talk about the side effects that are coming from some of these injections. And I think it's really important that people are heard about this, because it is possible to do these injections incorrectly or to do them in a way that is painful for people. And if we are going to make sure that we don't have huge amounts of, we're going to make sure that people actually in the community support this treatment, talk about it positively to other people and to other consumers, then we really do need to take people seriously. And of course, we've briefly touched on the fluctuations and tapering off towards the end of the dose, but those are really important points for people who are seeking stability, who are seeking to not be hanging out. As soon as someone starts feeling like they're in withdrawal or like it's not holding them, it really opens up the possibility to really destroy that stability and to go and do things such as what Max talked about, which is essentially using towards the end of their dose. So in conclusion, a huge number of the positive benefits of injectable bupe are about the restrictions of the current system, quite frankly, rather than a benefit of the drug itself. The affordances are often about making the system as it currently works work better for you. When I had the opportunity to travel on using methadone pills, I felt incredibly free then as well. There are ways around it. The trouble is our system sort of locks us into something. So LABE is being seen as a solution for what I believe to be a system which is not that effective. In Victoria, we really have to harmonise the cost structure somehow. It's wildly variant and unfair, to be honest. As we've talked about, psychosocial and peer support are important, but so many people can't access it. We really need to, something I've noticed really clearly over the past couple of years is clinicians talking about good or bad treatments, methadone clearly being one of the bad treatments and long-acting injectable being a good one. It's really unhelpful for the self-stigma stuff we talked about. It's really unhelpful for people who don't want to take Suboxone or can't take Suboxone to feel like they're on a dirty drug. So really, as LABE comes more and more into common usage, I think we have to really understand and not lose the importance of methadone as well. This is about choice. Ideally, we've been told over and over, we've been told at different times when new treatments have come in, buprenorphine through to Suboxone through to long-acting injectable bupe, but this is about more choice. But until now, it hasn't really been about more choice. Buprenorphine got taken away and completely replaced by Suboxone. Some people, were fine on bupe, but then they had to go to Suboxone. That doesn't seem fair. However, long-acting injectable bupe does have its place, and for those who are ready, it can really, really help them thrive. And ultimately, as we know, that should be the goal, regardless of the treatment or drug type that we're utilising. So that's me. I'd like to thank Max and Jared for their stories, for all the Pams clients that fed into the rest of the slides, including community members that I spoke to Turning Point and Tony, and of course to Sarah, the Pams coordinator. Thanks.
Thank you both very much. We've got a number of questions. I'll make my way through them as best we can. The first one is there any difference for a female unique biology compared to males, i.e. Metabolism, stages of life, hormone interaction?
Right. So a medical question or a biochemistry question. I had a feeling some of these might come up. Look, I think so. Yeah. If anyone doesn't have any questions about side effects or particular contraindications or things that patients should know depending on their own medical history and position. There's a couple of things. There are the clinical guidelines that Professor Nick Lentzeris led that might be useful. There's also some specialist depot buprenorphine or LABE clinics, as they're coming to be known in Victoria. There's also some addiction medicine consultation helplines that might be able to provide where clinicians might be able to provide specialist support. So I think what I'll do, Rebecca, is I'll send you the links to all of those, and rather than trying to tease out from a non-biomedical or non-clinician, rather than trying to tease out side effects and different effects, it's probably better to go down that line, I think.
Thank you so much. And on that note, we might not ask those particular questions and we'll provide everyone with some additional information. Okay, did the LAB group require further support? I know with pharmacy, being a pharmacist, seeing someone a couple of times a week was beneficial just as a check-in.
Okay, thanks for that question. So looking at my particular study that, and I'll send a link to the study as well. So it was a qualitative study where we explored clients' experiences of depot buprenorphine. So everyone was still on depot buprenorphine at that time. Now, firstly, it'd be really interesting to do some more research with pharmacists' experiences just to explore this. And I know, touch wood, subject to a number of things, including funding, we are really looking forward to being able to do that. But in terms of from a pharmacist perspective, I guess it all comes back to this whole idea of, as Sione said, treatment matching, but the idea that I raised that different clients, depending on where they're at in life and their goals and their backgrounds. I mean, some might love coming into a pharmacy and really find that, and as people did in our study, really appreciate those supports or appreciate those daily conversations, appreciate the other supports that pharmacists could help out with. So some people really appreciated that. For other people, moving to depot buprenorphine sort of freed them up from that system. So some people, might drop out as such, or others might. So I'll start again. Some people might miss going to the pharmacy. Others might really appreciate those supports. So again, from a prescriber's perspective, or from a multidisciplinary care team that they might be seeing in a publicly funded service. Conversations it really would benefit a lot of people for conversations to take place. And if they're missing that support, if they liked going to the pharmacy, for example, and want to set that up again, I mean, it would be good for interdisciplinary care teams and prescribers to consider about how other supports could be offered to bridge those engagements that are missed out on. So,
thank you. Next one, thanks for the great talk. Any data about specifically how or where patients were getting information prior to initiating depot treatment?
That's a really good question, and I'm be interesting to hear from Sione as well on this. But just in terms of the study that I referred to. So most of those people were actually on a clinical trial, so they would have been receiving information about the product then. But also to note that NUA or NUAA in New South Wales has put out some a really useful peer resource that has a whole range of perspectives and information about depot buprenorphine. So what we heard in our study was that some clients in our study were accessing those resources from peer advocacy organisations. But I might actually defer that one over to Sione as well.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, so HRVIC actually uses those newer resources as well. There's no point reinventing the wheel. We might do a Victorian specific one soon, but there's so many variables that with cost and so on that we kind of haven't. But for the information around injectable bupe, those are great. Also, Pams was rung a lot for just basic advice around it. One of the points I'd make is that another, obviously, I think it's obvious anyway from our perspective, is definitely peer networks. So people talking through the networks about things. So the number of times I've been asked at the chemist or at different places when people know where I work and know that I'm also a peer, I've been asked about it, but very seldom does anyone that I speak to on the street, so to speak, call it lab or long-acting injectable bupe or whatever. Like it's like more often than not, it's that people are very confused about exactly what it is. And in fact, some people that I've spoken to think that it's think that it's the next step towards like a heroin trial or hydromorphone or injectables, as in something you'd inject normally. So I think it really is important to have this information as much as possible out there, because although a lot of good information goes through peer networks, sometimes if the information isn't high quality, it can lead to the wrong kind of information. But generally speaking, to be honest, I think the turning point trials right near the start were some of the places where people got most of the information initially when people are kind of linked into services and needle and syringe programs and so forth. But I think there's a huge number of people that still have no idea this exists, including probably people who would benefit really strongly from it. So I think there's a bit of work to be done to get it out there. I think we were definitely not sort of pushing information about it out early days simply because it was so uncertain how it was going to work in Victoria. But as that's becoming clearer, it's easier to talk about it in a mass kind of way. Usually it's easier to talk on a one-to-one level about stuff like this because there are so many variables for individuals.
Thank you very much. There was a related question. Does Harm Reduction Victoria have information for community members about depot buprenorphine and guidance?
Okay, so at the moment, like I said, we use Newers, but we should actually have some up in the next month or so. Like I said, I think what we were holding, I don't want to promise that, but what I was holding off on is the fact that what we were holding off on was just the fact that it was difficult to sort of point people towards some specific good places to go to actually to access it, and sort of we're really just referring people through to Pams so they could talk to Sarah about it. The other thing that I'd say is that Pams is responsible for putting that information together and getting it up on our website. And at the moment, especially through COVID and now, they're pretty well overrun with clients, and so that's always been their priority. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is we should have, and we don't have yet, but it should be up soon.
Thank you so much. Why is it so difficult for forensic populations to be prescribed depot bupe? And are patients explained the risks around use of both licit and illicit substances while on the program?
One thing I can reflect, I mean, Tony might have an actual answer, but one thing I can reflect on as far as forensic clients in prison in particular is that change can take quite some time to come to pass in prison. But I think that actually it is happening now, like it is more available. But it's tricky in many prisons to get any kind of healthcare or change to your pharmacotherapy, full stop. But I think it would be ideal if that could happen sooner.
Yeah, just on the back of Sioni's comments there, and I won't speak on behalf of another research team, but if anyone was at APSAD, they might have seen Professor Adrian Dunlop talk, and he's done and continues to do a lot of research in the forensic space. So I think they have some new work coming out and some new work plans, specifically exploring how depot buprenorphine plays out in prison settings in New South Wales. But just having seen his presentation at APSAD, there were a lot of benefits. One, of course, as Sione referred to, was removing the or lessening the risk of sort of standover tactics or diversion or things that might be particular to prison settings. I do remember that Adrian Dunlop did talk about a lot of positives of depot buprenorphine. But I can send a little bit of stuff has come out of that research. I can also send that in the links that Rebecca might send out later. But watch this space is what I'm trying to say. I know there's other work going on in that space.
Thank you. Next question. As a clinician, I've seen a definite trend of people who use injectable buprenorphine starting or increasing their methamphetamine use. Is this something that your study saw? And look forward to reading your study. Thank you.
So thanks for that question. So the study that I referred to was really an in-depth exploration of people's experiences. We did note that we had the feeling that in comparison to other international cohorts in that study, which was only 30 people, there was a relatively high proportion of ongoing methamphetamine use, but that also reflected sort of the wider population in Australia. On that note, we recruited from a wider quantitative study, and what I'll do is I'll send a link to that particular paper, because that quantitative study that looked at many more people's experiences over time did look at quality of life indicators, but also alcohol and other drug use indicators, and also harms as well that people experienced while being on the trial. So that will be able to, give you some more very precise information about the use of other drugs.
Thank you very much. We had a couple of questions related to that. How do you refer to this program?
So depending on which state in Australia people are, if people are in Victoria, people can just access all the normal contact and support lines and so forth in order to enter the sector. Or if they're currently in the sector and your particular service doesn't have a prescriber or depot buprenorphine clinic, there are some specialist clinics, and there are different ways to get in touch with those clinics, and also to receive technical advice for prescribers. And what I'll do is I'll include some dot points in the information from today, just about the contact numbers and contact details of those clinics, and where clinicians can get more support or be able to refer clients.
Thank you so much. Is there something in the middle? Can people use long-acting when it suits them to travel and do other things, and then resume more regular dosing when that works for their lifestyle?
So thanks again for that question. So the clinical guidelines that I referred to from that have been led by Professor Nick Lentzeris. There are a range of things that need to take place before someone can be prescribed the depot buprenorphine injection. They need to be, if they're taking sublingual buprenorphine or methadone, there's certain criteria, clinical criteria, I guess you might say, that people will need to meet in order to be safely prescribed depot buprenorphine. Similarly, with dose changes and also tapering off the product, that needs to be done in a careful way that's medically managed. So I think, what I'll do is I'll send a link to those prescriber guidelines, and depending on a patient's medical history and their specific needs, it'll always be best to get specialist consultation when making those decisions. But what I would say at this stage, the general idea of the product is to be on a weekly or monthly cycle in order to be on long-acting injectable buprenorphine over time as a harm reduction technique. But there are ways that drug can be prescribed depending on a patient's situation.
Thank you, Tony. Next question. As an AOD forensic clinician, I am really struggling with the referral process in Victoria and finding services that offer this to our forensic clients. I have recently referred to Pams, but not sure if this is the right thing to do. However, it came after 2 months of being faced with referrals being rejected. Is there a list of services GPs that we can refer to?
It is absolutely fine to refer to Pams if you need to, bearing in mind that it's it's a referral service itself. So obviously we can't prescribe, but you do have good contacts. I think Tony's referred a few times to some of the specialist clinics, but like you say, I think that I mean, you would know this being in forensic, is that it's actually often quite tricky to find prescribers full stop for pharmacotherapy, especially for people leaving prison, but even more so for long-acting injectable bupe, simply because of the difficulties around it. But I do think that Justice Health is now paying at least for a month or so's worth of treatment. I guess I'm not sure if Tony is able to share some of those prescribers with you or not. As far as I know, there isn't a list, and that's one of the issues with Victoria, is we've never been able to put together a list of prescribers in Victoria for any kind of public consumption, because many of the prescribers are dead set against having their name in public, to be really honest with you. So Pams operates in that way, where essentially they're the middle person, which is actually very, frankly, is really labour intensive and not the most efficient use of anyone's time. But it's partly to do with the stigma and discrimination and the fear around being having your prescribers having their details out there in public. It's crazy that there isn't even a real referral list, though. I would agree. Tony, do you have any?
I know, working with some of the direct line team, that they are constantly updating lists and also referral processes. So what I'll do is I'll check in, specifically about depot buprenorphine, and be able to provide you with a link just following this session.
Thank you very much. I'm just conscious of the time. I might ask one or two more. How many consumers in Victoria are on long-acting injectable buprenorphine?
Good question. Look, there has been a massive uptake in Victoria and New South Wales, but it depends on geography and also also Sublocade or Buvidal and different dosing arrangements and types of depot buprenorphine. Again, I think rather than misquoting the evidence, I'll get back with a more accurate figure and just in the info from today's session.
Thank you. Okay, this will be our final question. I've heard through a consumer that when they commenced long-acting injectable buprenorphine on a monthly dose, they had the first few doses at the 3-week mark rather than every 4 weeks. Is there a build-up or an adjust in the system?
Great question. So what I can, without giving or attempting to give medical advice about a particular patient circumstances, what I can do is just talk very briefly to the findings from my qualitative study. So like I said, for a lot of new clients, the thought and fear and uncertainty around any type of opioid agonist therapy not working properly is a real fear for people about going into withdrawal and having a really, really obviously uncomfortable and nasty experience. So what we found was that the best way that participants told us to manage that was to really check in with prescribing teams very early on in the piece, in the first few weeks or first couple of weeks of the monthly injection, if they were on the monthly. And in different circumstances, a number of clinical teams did make the promise and just gave the advice that if the product, if a client perceived that the product was running out in a subjective experience or tapering off too early, then a weekly dose or another opioid agonist therapy could be given to a patient to alleviate their concern that they were not going to be held by the product. So from the clients that we interviewed, that type of advice and that close relationship with the medical team often alleviated those fears. But anytime anyone's on an opioid agonist therapy, depending on their situation, if their subjective experience is that the product's not giving them the protection, for lack of a better word, that they want, and they feel like they might be going to withdrawal. I mean, at that point, it's really important that they obviously speak to the prescriber as soon as possible, because there are ways to be able to manage that.
Thank you very much. Now, thank you both for joining us today. Again, I'm aware of the time. I'm just going to make one statement from one of our attendees from Justice Health, who said, yes, Justice Health Victoria are paying for a subsidy at pharmacies for 1 month post-prison. So that's fantastic news. Thank you everyone for attending. Please, if you could spend the extra time to do the feedback survey, and like promised, we will send some slides and extra material that Tony's referred to. Thank you everyone. Have a fabulous afternoon.